Turning to Noir news, we have a contract update for you. You will have heard from our previous episode that we had deployed to Solitude and got involved in the local politics there, essentially helping to realign the entire region. Well, things did not stop there. As you'll remember, we had quite a few interactions with faction warfare groups on that contract. And apparently somebody liked us so much that they hired us to go into the war zone to fight between the Gallente and the Caldari. And that, I think, is a first for us. I don't recall us having a long-term faction warfare contract before, and it has been very interesting.
I've loved every minute of this contract, I have to be honest. Again, going back to my first days in EVE, my first venture into PvP was being taken by some keen FC into faction warfare space. And it's interesting to me how, when you get into EVE, a lot of it is about avoiding being blown up or avoiding conflict or avoiding, some sort of consequence to your actions. That goes in high sec as it does in roaming through low sec, but also if you live in wormhole space or if you live in null sec. But that was the first taste I had of people who wanted to fight each other. And that's pretty much what kept me going in the game and got me into PvP. So for me, this contract has been an opportunity to revisit some of the things that really got me into PvP and EVE and see it from a completely different point of view. I'm now 18 months further along my journey and I have not returned to faction warfare space since. And it's been very interesting to see it from a different point of view.
Well, let's talk about that. What's as good as you remember? What's changed? Are there shortcomings to faction warfare that you hadn't noticed before that you do now?
I think for me, what's changed is very little. I remember that, you'd always have a few characters here and there dotted around. Some wanted to fight you and some didn't. Some were willing to take on larger groups of people jumping into the system and some weren't. That bit hasn't changed at all. What's good about it, though, is it's still that place where people want to fight you. I've never been anywhere else in EVE where you can get in a ship and you can roam around and not everyone is going to run away from you. Some people will take on fights outnumbered. Some people will do some very interesting things with escalation. Where else can EVE can you take out a T1 frigate and get reliable content without being sort of overwhelmed by something? But that's not always the case in faction warfare, of course.
And we have experienced a pretty wide range of engagements. It's either been frigate 1v1s or like really small fights there. We have had a couple like 5v5-ish type fights, but really it's been like one or two people versus one or two people, and then it's been just cap drops.
Absolutely.
Not much in the middle there. I was kind of hoping to see, I don't know, like roaming Brutix fleets from the Gallente or something appropriately themed, but it just doesn't seem to be out there, at least right now.
No, there's a value loss in faction warfare for like the low end stuff is really easy to manage and loss mitigation is really like easy, right? And the cap drop level is where it's going anyway. So not a lot of people want to participate in that middle ground where they're gonna if they take out their 5 Brutixes, they're definitely getting cap dropped or nobody will fight them. That's basically how their night will end.
We did have one engagement when we first started the contract where we had a few cruisers with us. I was just providing some support to the locals. And we were looking at taking some of the open complexes where, anything goes. And as a result, there were some T2 cruisers around in our group. And we were returning home, really, at the end of a successful little evening, taking some space and things. And we jumped into a system and there happened to be a few Vexers sort of hanging around on the gate. They didn't seem to be camping or waiting for somebody to jump through. We just seemed to be passing them in transit. Well, because the two groups, the one I was with and the group of Vexers were effectively at war with each other, they decided to fight on the gate. And it seemed to be a reasonable engagement, cruisers versus cruisers. And then suddenly an Erasio decloaks and a fax drops. And it's the first time in my EVE time that I've seen a fax repping T1 cruisers. Very effective, of course. Needless to say, we didn't come out of that engagement positive, but it was very interesting to see the risks people will take with some of their caps.
We were just talking about that last night. The fax is extremely efficient pilot-wise. Perhaps not ISK-wise these days, but if your shortage is not money, but rather bodies, risking a fax is actually pretty good. I mean, your chances of getting counter-dropped are, they're pretty substantial, but, if that doesn't happen, it's pretty difficult to dislodge you or your fleet from that grid.
Absolutely. I mean, there was a limited choice at this point, of course. The people on grid, they couldn't jump back through the gate. They'd engaged. They couldn't get away, so they just had to grin and bear it, really. Quite fun to see an Arazu appear. It's very, the Arazu, quite common, but quite fun to see that fax appear before my eyes. It's not something I see very often, being in a small gang group, really.
We should talk a little bit about what we're doing here. The contract is still technically ongoing, but it's wrapping up. It'll be close to done by the time this podcast comes out, so I think we're all right to talk about it. The initial plan, as I understood it, was kind of framed as the Siege of Ostingel, which, if you're not familiar with the geography of the area, Ostingel is right next to Stackmon, which is the Placid trade hub. It's also a very active system for EVE University. And for us, as a matter of fact, with our MPSI program. There's a lot of stuff going on there. Ostingale is low-sec. It's right adjacent to that high-sec system. So it's a natural choke point, a natural strategic place for you to have camps, for you to have maybe safe structures for you to jump in terms of caps and freighters and stuff. And it has a lot of gates, so it goes a lot of different places within Placid. Can lead you to Syndicate, can lead you to Solitude within a couple jumps. So it is a pretty key strategic location, even if you're not involved in faction warfare. Now, if you are in faction warfare, it's a gem. We were initially planned to do like a major offensive operation there, and we did start to do that maybe for the first day or two, but it became immediately apparent to everybody involved that Gallente also kind of had the same idea, and they were pushing back against the Caldari in several systems. So the coordinated offensive turned into more of a coordinated defensive action as we wound up doing more cleanup assistance, trying to keep faction warfare plexes from falling into the hands of the Caldari Militia, while we were going on the offense more on like a citadel basis, attacking a few key citadels for different groups that are either connected to the Gallente Militia or sympathetic to the Gallente Militia. So that's kind of where things have been at for the past couple days. We're wrapping up some of the structures now. I don't really do faction warfare, so I have a hard time getting a sense of how typical the balance of power is in the various systems as far as like Gallente versus Caldari. But it does seem like the Gallente have gained some significant ground and the Caldari have been kind of backed up. But it hasn't been a real rout or anything like that. I definitely don't get the sense that either group feels a lot of momentum for or against them. It's just kind of a grind right now.
For me, it's interesting that with faction warfare, it's often mentioned in different parts of EVE sort of media. But if you sort of go searching for, I tried to do a bit of research prior to our contract, a little bit of a refresh about faction warfare, and you get a few YouTube videos or posts online about how, what to put together, what sort of T1 frigate to put together, how to get some loyalty points. Very little else. Okay, so you don't really get a sense of the overarching mechanics of faction warfare unless you speak to the people involved in it. And I've since learned that perhaps what's happening with faction warfare is the loyalty points generated are, of course, valuable. If they're Caldari, then your Caldari loyalty points are going to be able to be spent in the stores for items that are very useful. I mean, how often do we use Caldari Navy ammo or the certain ships and things?
Yeah, absolutely.
And then on the other hand, then you've got the Gallente loyalty points being equally valuable to other people. What seems to be happening is, and perhaps this is well known, I don't know, but there is a vested interest in the wider New Eden community for perhaps the prices of these items to fluctuate. And by, say, Caldari being dominant for a period of time, that's going to decrease the value of these items because, of course, Caldari loyalty points are going to be much easier to come by, and therefore you're going to see a lot more of these Caldari items, and then they're going to reduce in price. Well, that as a consequence is going to.
Before you go on, we should explain to our audience, if they're not familiar with faction warfare, as your control of the war zone increases, you get bonuses to your loyalty points. It can be pretty significant. I think if it's top tier, you get double the loyalty points. So if your side is winning, you're getting a lot of these loyalty points much faster, and you can trade them for items effectively cheaper.
I didn't realize that. I heard something about tiers. I didn't know anything about
that's
it.
what they're talking about. There are certain milestones at which they unlock militia-wide rewards of greater loyalty points for everything that they're doing. I think it applies to both kills and plexing. Wow. So as you're winning or have won, you get to reap the rewards for a little while. But then, of course, like you mentioned, the market forces, the group that's on the other end, their loyalty points become more scarce and thus more valuable.
It's a very interesting dynamic and something that I not even considered prior to this contract.
I mean, I like the idea. You should absolutely have incentives to fight and win. And if you're on the winning side, that should confer some advantages. It does have the downside of kind of setting up this incentive system for people to game which side is winning for how long, rather than just let the conflict play out organically. I do think that kind of sucks, but I'm not sure there's a real way around it.
Yes, indeed. That did. I was a bit dismayed by that, if I'm honest.
Yeah, the way around it would be a reconstruction, large scale, right? So
not happening.
That's right.
Oh, CCP. Faction warfare, your unloved stepchild. They have done some things to it, but yeah, it clearly has some issues. The botability of the sites seems extremely high and extremely low risk. Effectively, we're seeing a lot of bots and Tristans just go into the sites, and then as soon as you appear on D-scan, they're already out, and they'll just rinse and repeat that. It's like botting a nullsec, except if you successfully catch it, instead of killing an Ishtar, you're killing a Tech 1 frigate.
Potentially one without much of a fit in as well.
Yeah, they don't really have much of an incentive to fit it well. Just fit it literally the bare minimum to do, I guess, orbiting. I don't even know if they have to kill an NPC. It's not clear to me.
Well, of course, I didn't realize this either, but if you're defensively plexing, so if your group already has control, then no, you don't have to kill an NPC. In fact, the NPC is in some way in your defense.
Yeah, that's a hard nut to crack design-wise. We should talk about the other hard nut to crack, which is Cruiser's Crew, the primary offensive, defensive wing of the Gallente Militia, as far as I can tell. There are, of course, other big-name corps in the area, like Aderon Robotics. Shout out to those guys. But Cruiser's Crew has definitely done the heavy lifting in the area. You might be familiar with them, audience, from our contract in Solitude. Placid is actually their main staging area, or was recently. So we're running into them quite a bit. Mostly on the structure fights themselves, not actually like any of the complex stuff, although we might have run into them occasionally. Primarily, they have been the structure attack and defense arm of Gallente Militia.
So my knowledge of Cruiser's Crew goes back to a few posts I saw a few years ago where they advertised themselves as returning, and they said that they're the type of group that would take fights no matter what. Whether they thought they could win or not, they would take the fight. And I have to say, so far, that's kind of been my experience.
Well, they're definitely quite scrappy. They're pretty substantial numbers-wise, so they can take a lot of these fights and have a pretty good chance of winning them. And the other night, we had a group with, I think it was State Protectorate, No Forks, and IRED. There are some local groups in the area, and they're attacking a structure. Cruiser's Crew showed up to defend and dropped Snuff super caps. So they have some pretty powerful bat phones. So they're making that statement with a lot of confidence for a reason. But at the same time, yeah, they're quite good. I know their reputation is somewhat controversial. Some people like them, some people don't like them. Some people don't like them specifically because they're willing to work with Snuff. I've never had an issue with Cruiser's Crew I know a lot of people don't like their alliance exec. He's never done anything wrong to me that I'm aware of. But yeah, he's definitely outspoken and definitely a group that likes to kind of be an instigator and goes out and finds fights and starts fights. Kind of go in their own way as well. Like they don't really make a lot of local friends, it seems.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my other contact with Cruz's crew has been when I was in Eve University, and they would just suddenly appear sometimes in large groups and get involved in various sort of scraps and arguments over timers and things. Never really felt that they were sort of trying to blob outship. They would certainly, bring more than you had and try and win, but I never really got the sense that they were actively trying to shut you down. They just really seem to be a group that wants to have content, and they don't seem to mind where that content comes from necessarily.
I mean, unless you're a less than 10 corp, pretty much everybody has that approach. Some groups are more willing to take risks than others. Pretty much everybody is looking to maximize the chance that they're going to go on field and win. And if they're going to bring more people to make that happen, then pretty much everybody's willing to do that. So I wouldn't say that's a knock on any alliance, really.
Oh, indeed. And I just felt that they always held back in some way, which was nice when I was in Eve Uni, because at least you felt that you had an opportunity to fight back. And again, even in this contract area, sometimes it feels like they're just holding back a little bit, like we do sometimes, just to sort of keep the content flowing.
Well, the only experience I've had with them outside of the snuff drop on this campaign, we teamed up with Kybernauts to hit a structure. So armor timer. We did pretty good progress. I want to say we were almost 2/3 done, and they turned up with a 15-man mixed battleship Guardian fleet, which we were looking at with I think we had 10 to 12 Drekovics with, I think a little bit of that was like mixed support. So maybe like 9 Drex, a Logi, and some tackle. We were like, that's a tough fight, but that might be engageable. And then they showed a Pilgrim. We're like, oh, it's going to have at least one fax behind it, plus who knows what else. Okay. We also knew they had a Hodred because we had seen it Sino into position earlier. So it was like, all right, well, I guess we won't do that. But it was close. We were pretty close to wanting to engage them. If we hadn't seen the Pilgrim, we probably would have, I think. Well, that's just the way of it. But, again, Kyber had less people, but thought maybe the odds might be in their favor. DPS and maybe damage mitigation-wise, they were willing to take it. So, props to CC for at least trying to look engageable.
Which is also a great strategy. Look engageable.
Right. Unfortunately, the snuff super drop that happened just totally devastated the fleet that we were in. They were totally caught out. Also in Drex, incidentally. They tried to pull range and escape most of their fleet. I think they got a fair few away, actually. But yeah, it was a pretty painful loss for the locals. But that's the way it goes in low sec, and null sec too, for that matter. You try to do what you can. You want the fight. You want to try to make it happen. Every side thinks, if you're going to take the field, your side thinks that you have what you need to win. If the other side takes the field, they think they have what they need to win. It really comes down to who knew more about the other side, who was right, who theory crafted, and who was going to execute better.
And who's going to take the risk ultimately.
Yeah, because all combat in Eve, except if you're like flying through a gate or something, certainly structure timers, they're very optional. You can elect to bring your fleet and maybe lose the fleet and maybe lose the structure, or you can elect to just let the structure die or get saved. You would only put your fleet on field if you think that you could win. Now, what that means for different groups, that's as varied as there are groups in Eve. There are some groups which need like a 2-to-1, 3-to-1 advantage till they're confident that happens. Some groups just want to know if they have a capital or super capital advantage. Some groups are confident they can kite and snipe and dance around danger enough to maybe get some kills. And if they can't, achieve the objective, they'll at least make the enemy fleet bleed a little bit. There are some groups that will do it if they think they have a chance of winning, period, and they'll just kind of go for it. and everywhere in between.
I think my favorite variety on that is when a group engages because they want to do something rather than not do something. And they will perhaps take a fight or take an engagement which they know they can't win. But they'll do it because they might lose their members or their members' interest if they don't do something to defend, or if they don't do something to make content. And I think when that pressure is applied, and you never know what's going on the other side. When 30 people turn up for a fleet and the FC says, "Oh, we're not going to do anything with this," you can only do that so often before people stop logging in. So I think that dynamic is a fascinating one for me, for Eve.
Yeah, it's a knife's edge, because it can also be very demoralizing if you take that fleet and suicide it.
Absolutely.
You really got to know your people. I
get this sense the Cruises crew are the group that maybe have allowed their members to feel okay about losses.
It is a strange and shifting paradigm, small gang combat. And it's very difficult to manage.
Yeah, I hope we do get the leader of Cruiser's crew on the show. That's who we're trying to get for this show. He's definitely indicated interest, so hopefully we can find a show that'll fit his schedule. But they did experience a pretty drastic loss in the Solitude campaign, and that was the last we saw of them. Now, granted, they engaged in that with every expectation they had what they needed to win, and it was kind of a rude surprise that they did not. But, that was a pretty substantial loss for them. It seemed to take them out of the fight. Now, I think there's significant evidence that there are also other things going on behind the scenes with as far as their relationship with the defenders, which maybe even if they were inclined to show up, maybe they just didn't want to. And I think that's perfectly fair as well. They certainly haven't been shy about fighting in Placid so far.
Absolutely. I did wonder if the part of the reason that they stopped coming to those fights in Solitude was because they were no longer invested in it, rather than because they didn't think they could win, because they certainly could have competed.
Yeah, I mean, I think word in the weeds that I was hearing was that the defenders, like we were just talking about in their paradigm, the defenders of the structures weren't able to form and be effective, and that there's not a lot of incentive for a defender's bat phone to show up if the defender's not there, right?
I mean, why should I care about this structure if you're not going to care about the structure? It's your structure. I definitely know that feel. There's a famous Twitch clip of me giving some Alliance in Great Wildlands a bit of a riot act read, because they're like, "Whoa, I don't want to go fight." I'm like, "Well, I think we can win, man." He's like, "No, what's the point?" Like, I don't know, man. It's your structure. You tell me what the point is. I'm here to help you. Why should I fleet up and spend my time and risk my ships if you're not even willing to do that? It doesn't make any sense. No, you can pay me to care, but that's all other matter. But right now, for the next couple days anyway, we care about the Gallente Militia versus the Caldari Militia, and it's definitely been interesting so far. I would actually love to come back to faction warfare with us actually in one of the militias. We tried to make that happen for this one, but unfortunately our standings weren't quite there. But it seemed like that would be very interesting, and hopefully we get another contract opportunity to do something like that down the line, just to give it a shot. I think it'd be cool.
Absolutely.
Yes. Noir Mercenary Alliance, it's because we care.
You can rent our empathy for very affordable prices.